The courthouse erupted into chaos at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. That would rewrite everything. Detective Sarah Chen's hand trembled as she gripped the leash, her knuckles white against the leather that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Around, her voices rose to a crescendo of disbelief, anger, and something that sounded dangerously close to fear. The gallery behind the wooden barrier had become a sea of pointing fingers and open mouths, reporters scrambling over each other like vultures, sensing fresh carrion. "Your Honor, this is absolutely unprecedented." District Attorney Morrison's voice cracked as he half stood from his chair, his usually pristine suit jacket twisted from where he'd jerked forward in shock. But Judge Helena Rodriguez wasn't listening to Morrison. Her eyes, sharp as broken glass behind wire-rimmed glasses, were locked on the German shepherd sitting perfectly still at Sarah's side. Rex's ears were pinned back, not in submission, but in that particular way that meant he was processing information no human could detect. His dark eyes swept the courtroom with the methodical precision of a trained professional, and when they settled on the defense table, a low growl rumbled from his chest, so quiet it might have been mistaken for breathing, but Sarah felt it vibrate through the leash like an earthquake warning. "Detective Chen." Judge Rodriguez's voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk. "Explain to this court why your K9 partner is refusing to respond to Officer Martinez's commands." The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. Sarah could feel every pair of eyes in the courtroom boring into her. The defendant's smirk from behind his expensive legal team, the victim's family clutching each other in the front row, the dozen cops who'd worked this case for 8 months and were now watching their star witness apparently malfunction. Officer Martinez, 6'2", 15 years on the force, and the department's primary K9 handler, stood 3 feet away with his hand extended toward Rex, his face flushed red with embarrassment and something that looked suspiciously like wounded pride. "Heel, Rex. Heel." His voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question, but Rex didn't even turn his head. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She'd known this moment would come eventually. The moment when she'd have to explain something. That sounded impossible even to her own ears. "Your Honor, Rex will only respond to me." The laughter started somewhere in the back of the gallery. Sharp, disbelieving bursts that spread like a contagion until half the courtroom was snickering. A voice called out, "Lady thinks she's the dog whisperer." More laughter. A bailiff moved toward the disruption, but the damage was already spreading. Defense. Attorney Patricia Walsh rose from her seat with the fluid grace of a predator who'd just spotted wounded prey. "Your Honor, I move to have this entire demonstration dismissed. Detective Chen's co-emotional attachment to her animal clearly compromises any testimony this dog might provide." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to the scar hidden beneath her. Collar, 3 inches of puckered flesh that Rex's teeth had left 8 months ago when he'd pulled her away from a bomb she couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't smell. The same bomb that had been meant for the man now sitting at the defense table, watching this circus with dead eyes, and a smile that never reached past his lips. "Rex, show them," she whispered, so quietly that only he could hear. What happened? Next would be replayed on every news channel for the next 72 hours, analyzed by experts who'd never held a leash in their lives, and debated in coffee shops from Maine to California. Rex rose to his feet with the fluid precision of flowing water and moved toward the defense table. Not fast enough to trigger the bailiff's weapons, but with a purpose that made every human in the room hold their breath. He stopped precisely 18 inches from Thomas Hartwell, the man accused of bombing the courthouse annex, the man whose trial had been delayed 6 times due to procedural complications, the man who'd walked free on technicalities 3 times before this. Rex sat, raised his right paw and pointed directly at Hartwell's briefcase. The alert, the one that meant explosives, the one that meant everyone in this room was about to die. The laughter died as if someone had cut its throat. "Bomb." Sarah's voice cracked the silence like thunder. "Everyone out, now!" Chaos erupted in 3 dimensions. Bodies crashed into each other as people fought for the exits. Judge Rodriguez's gavel hit the bench repeatedly, a staccato rhythm that no one heard over their own heartbeats. Bailiffs rushed toward Hartwell, who was no longer smiling. But Sarah's eyes were locked on Rex, who hadn't moved from his position. His ears were no longer pinned back. They were standing at full attention, and his body language was screaming something she'd learned to read like her native language. It wasn't just the briefcase. Rex's eyes flicked to the judge's bench, then to the court reporter's station, then to the emergency exit everyone was stampeding toward. 3 more devices. At least. Stop! Sarah's voice somehow cut through the pandemonium. Nobody move. Rex, show me. This time nobody laughed. Rex began a careful circuit of the room, his nose working with the concentrated focus of a surgeon. Each step was deliberate, purposeful. When he reached the judge's bench, he sat and raised his paw again. Then the court reporter's desk. Then, and this sent ice water through Sarah's veins, the emergency exit that 50 people were pressed against like sardines in a can. Thomas Hartwell was no longer sitting at the defense table. Somehow, in the chaos, he'd melted into the crowd. Near the main entrance, his expensive suit jacket discarded, his silver hair covered by a bailiff's cap he'd grabbed from somewhere. But Rex's head tracked him like a radar dish, and when their eyes met across the panicked crowd, Hartwell's mask finally slipped completely. "Hello, detective," he mouthed, his lips forming words only she could see. "Thanks for the dance." Then he was gone, swallowed by the evacuation, leaving behind a courtroom full of bombs and the terrible understanding that this had never been about a trial at all. It had been about getting Rex and Sarah exactly where he wanted them. Section 2. Dual backstory, protagonist plus animal. 8 months earlier, the rain hammered Portland's streets like bullets from an angry sky, turning the asphalt into a mirror that reflected the city's neon soul back at itself in Mindine's fractured pieces. Detective Sarah Chen sat in her unmarked Crown Vic outside the police station, watching water cascade down her windshield, and trying to convince herself she wasn't about to make the biggest mistake of her career. The transfer papers lay on her passenger seat, already signed in blue ink that had bled slightly in the humidity. After 12 years working homicide in San Francisco, she was walking away from everything she'd built, to chase ghosts in a city where it rained more than it didn't, and the coffee was supposedly better than human decency. But it wasn't really about the coffee. And it sure as hell wasn't about the rain. It was about the dreams that woke her up at 3 a.m. with the taste of copper in her mouth and the sound of her partner's last words echoing in her ears. "Sarah, behind you." Detective Michael Santos had been 3 weeks from retirement, 2 days from his daughter's wedding, and 6 feet from Sarah when the bullet found the gap in his vest. The same bullet that had been meant for her. The same bullet that had ended a 25-year career and left her standing over his body in a warehouse that smelled like rust and failure, holding his service weapon, while sirens screamed in the distance. The official report called it an exemplary display of police work. The commendation letter mentioned her quick thinking and decisive action. The department therapist said trauma responses were normal and time would heal the guilt. None of them mentioned how it felt to know you were alive, because someone better than you wasn't. Sarah pushed through the glass doors of Portland PD's K9 unit and immediately understood why people said dogs could smell fear. The moment she stepped into the training facility, every animal in the place turned to look at her with the kind of attention usually reserved for predators or prey. Their handlers continued their routines, obstacle courses, obedience drills, scent work, but the dogs knew something had changed in their environment. Something broken had just walked in. "You must be Chen." The voice belonged to Sergeant Rita Morales, a woman whose presence filled rooms despite being barely 5'4". Her graying hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, and her eyes held the particular combination of warmth and steel that came from 20 years of working with animals that could kill you if they chose to. "Yes, ma'am." Reporting for K9. Training assignment. Morales studied her with the kind of attention usually reserved for evidence at crime scenes. Homicide detective wants to work with dogs. That's not a career move you see every day. Sarah had prepared for this question, rehearsed answers that sounded professional and forward-thinking. What came out of her mouth instead was the truth. "I need to learn how to trust again." Something shifted in Morales's expression. Not softness exactly, but recognition. Trust goes both ways in this job, detective. The dog has to trust you just as much as you trust the dog. Maybe more. She led Sarah through the facility, past German shepherds practicing bite work and Belgian Malinois navigating obstacle courses that looked like something from military training. The air smelled like sawdust, leather, and something indefinably wild that reminded Sarah her ancestors had once lived in caves and depended on animals for survival. Most of our dogs come from specialist breeders, Morales explained as they walked. Carefully selected bloodlines, early socialization, months of preliminary training before they ever see a police station. But every once in a while, she stopped in front of a kennel that was separated from the others by 20 feet of empty space. Inside, a German shepherd lay on his side, his breathing shallow, and his eyes tracking their movement with the wary intelligence of something that had learned the world could hurt you without warning. Rex came to us 6 months ago. Retired military working dog, served 3 tours in Afghanistan with Marine Corps EOD units. His handler was killed by an IED that Rex detected 30 seconds too late to matter. Sarah felt something twist in her chest. What happened to him? Physical recovery took 4 months. Shrapnel wounds, minor brain trauma from the blast concussion. But the real damage, Morales paused, choosing her words carefully. He won't work with male handlers. Won't even let them in his kennel. The department psychiatrist thinks he's associating masculine voices with the memory of his handler's death. They stood in silence, watching Rex watch them. His ears were partially flattened against his head, not in aggression but in something that looked heartbreakingly like grief. Sarah had seen that expression before, in mirrors, usually around 3 a.m. when she couldn't sleep, and her apartment felt too quiet. Every trainer in the unit has tried working with him, Morales continued. He goes through the motions, follows basic commands, but there's no connection, no trust. The city's getting pressure to retire him to civilian life, maybe find him a family that can give him the quiet life he's earned. Sarah found herself kneeling beside the kennel without conscious decision. Rex raised his head, and for a moment, their eyes met through the chain link. His were dark brown, almost black, and held depths that spoke of places and experiences no civilian dog would ever know. "Hey there," she said softly, not reaching toward him but simply making herself available. "I heard you've been having a rough time." Rex's ears shifted slightly forward, not much but enough to suggest he was listening. "I know what it's like," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "When someone you trust gets hurt and you couldn't stop it. When every sound makes you think something bad is about to happen. When you wake up, and for just a second you forget they're gone, and then you remember all over again." Something changed in Rex's posture. Not dramatic. A slight relaxation in his shoulders, a marginally less guarded expression. But Morales noticed it too, because Sarah heard her intake of breath. "The thing is," Sarah said, still talking to Rex but aware that Morales was listening to every word, "I think maybe we're both tired of being broken. Maybe we could try being broken together for a while, see if that feels any different." Rex stood, not quickly, not aggressively, but with purpose. He walked to the front of his kennel and sat down directly in front of Sarah, close enough that she could see the small scars on his muzzle where shrapnel had been removed, close enough to see the intelligence and pain living behind his eyes, close enough to see the exact moment when he decided to trust her. "Well," Morales said quietly, "that's the most he's engaged with anyone since he got here." Sarah remained kneeling, letting Rex make the next move. After a long moment, he pressed his nose against the chain link just briefly, just enough to say hello. "When do we start?" Sarah asked. Morales was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if she'd somehow said the wrong thing. When she finally spoke, her voice carried 20 years of watching people and dogs find each other across impossible distances. "How about now?" Section 3. Escalating Mystery and Bonds. 6 months after their first meeting, the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Portland's industrial district looked like every cop's nightmare. Multiple entry points, sightlines broken by stacked shipping containers, and the kind of shadows that could hide anything from homeless camps to drug labs to worse things that didn't have names yet. Sarah felt Rex tense beside her as they approached the main entrance. His ears were pinned back in that particular way that meant his training was overriding his instincts, but barely. The tip of his nose twitched as he sorted through scent signatures invisible to human perception, rust and decay, and something chemical that made the air taste metallic. "Talk to me, partner," she murmured, her voice pitched for his ears alone. Rex's response was subtle, a slight shift in his stance that brought him closer to her left leg, positioning himself between Sarah and whatever had triggered his concern. Not fear exactly, but the heightened awareness of a professional who'd learned that complacency could be fatal. "Control, this is K97 approaching the warehouse from the east entrance," Sarah spoke into her radio, her free hand resting lightly on Rex's shoulders. "Dog is alerting to something inside." "Copy, K97. Backup units are still 10 minutes out. Hold your position until—" The radio crackled to static as they stepped inside the building, concrete walls and metal infrastructure killing the signal like it had never existed. Sarah felt the familiar flutter of isolation that came with being cut off from support, but Rex's steady presence beside her pushed the anxiety back to manageable levels. They'd been tracking the bombing suspect for 3 weeks, following a trail of component purchases and suspicious behavior that had led them through half of Oregon's underground economy. Thomas Hartwell was smart, careful, and connected enough to stay 2 steps ahead of conventional police work. But he couldn't hide from Rex's nose, and he couldn't anticipate the bond between a broken cop and a damaged dog who'd found something worth protecting in each other. The warehouse floor stretched out like an aircraft hangar, broken only by support. Pillars and the skeletal remains of industrial equipment that had been abandoned to rust and time. Sarah's flashlight beam carved through air thick with dust and chemical residue, creating a cone of visibility that only emphasized how much they couldn't see. Rex stopped so suddenly that Sarah nearly stumbled into him. His nose was working overtime, now nostrils flaring as he processed information that might as well have been written in a foreign language, as far as she was concerned. Then he did something she'd never seen before. He backed up 3 steps, positioning himself directly behind her, and sat down. "Rex?" Sarah's voice carried a note of confusion. In 6 months of training and 3 months of active duty, he had never once positioned himself behind her. Canines were trained to lead, to place themselves between their handlers and potential threats, to be the tip of the spear in dangerous situations. Rex wasn't cowering. His posture was alert, professional, ready for action, but he was clearly indicating that whatever was ahead of them, Sarah needed to be the one to take point. The realization hit her like cold water. Rex wasn't protecting her from whatever was in the warehouse. He was protecting whatever was in the warehouse from him. Sarah moved forward with exaggerated care, each step deliberate and announced. Her flashlight beam swept left and right in practiced patterns, but her attention was split between the environment and Rex's behavior. He followed exactly 3 feet behind her, close enough to respond to commands but far enough back to avoid triggering whatever instinct was keeping him in defensive mode. They found the bomb-making station in what had once been the warehouse's office space, a metal desk covered with scales, timers, and enough plastic explosive to level a city block. But that wasn't what made Sarah's blood turn to ice water. Sitting on the floor beside the desk, cable tied to a support beam and very much alive, was a girl who couldn't have been more than 16 years old. "Please," the girl whispered, her voice hoarse from what might have been hours of calling for help. "Please don't let him hurt me anymore." Sarah holstered her weapon and moved toward the girl, her training overriding the questions flooding her mind. Cable ties, first aid, assessment for injuries, secure the scene. But before she could take more than 2 steps, Rex's low whine stopped. Her dead. It wasn't a warning exactly, more like a question. Rex was staring at the girl with the kind of intense focus he usually reserved for hidden explosives or armed suspects. His ears were fully forward now, and Sarah could see the muscles in his legs coiled for action. "What is it, boy?" Sarah kept her voice calm, professional, but her hand drifted back toward her weapon. Rex's instincts had kept them alive through a dozen dangerous situations. If he was concerned about something, she needed to listen. The girl's Eyes were locked on Rex with an expression that didn't quite match her apparent helplessness. Fear, yes, but something else underneath it. Something that looked almost like recognition. "He's going to attack me," the girl said, her voice gaining strength. "That dog is going to attack me. You have to get him away from here." Sarah felt the pieces of a puzzle shifting in her mind, trying to find their proper configuration. Rex's unusual behavior, the girl's reaction to him, the fact that this warehouse had been under surveillance for weeks, but no one had reported seeing a hostage. "Rex, stay," Sarah commanded, then took one careful step toward the girl. Rex remained motionless, but she could feel his attention like a physical weight. "What's your name?" Sarah asked. "Emma. Emma Morrison. My dad is David Morrison. He's the district attorney. Please, you have to help me. He said he'd kill me if the police found him." District Attorney Morrison, the man prosecuting Thomas Hartwell, the man whose daughter had supposedly been traveling in Europe for the past 6 months, too busy with college and adventure, to attend her father's high-profile case. Sarah took another step forward and watched Rex's reaction carefully. His posture shifted slightly, not aggressive but ready, like he was preparing to make a decision that would end badly for someone. "Emma, I'm going to help you," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the growing certainty that something was very, very wrong. "But first, I need you to tell me how long you've been here." 3 days. Maybe 4. I lose track of time when it's dark. Sarah's flashlight swept the area around the girl, cataloguing details her training had taught her to notice. No food wrappers or water bottles, no waste or smell of human habitation, no marks on the concrete from someone struggling against restraints, and most telling of all, no dust on the girl's clothes, despite being in an abandoned warehouse for 3 days. Rex made a sound Sarah had never heard before, something between a whine and a growl that seemed to come from deep in his chest. When she looked back at him, his eyes weren't on the girl anymore. They were on the bomb components spread across the desk, components that hadn't been there when they'd entered the warehouse 15 minutes ago. Sarah. The girl's voice had changed, completely, losing its breathless fear and gaining something that sounded almost like amusement. "That's your name, isn't it? Sarah Chen, the detective who couldn't save her partner." Sarah's hand found her weapon, but she didn't draw it yet. "How do you know that name?" "Because I know everything about you. I know you wake up at 3 a.m. calling for Michael Santos. I know you moved to Portland because you couldn't stand looking at the place where he died. And I know you think that dog is going to save you from the nightmares." The cable ties around the girl's wrists were loose, props, not restraints. She was sitting on the floor by choice, not necessity. And her eyes, when they met Sarah's in the flashlight beam, held the cold intelligence of someone much older than 16. "Rex knows, doesn't he?" The girl smiled, and it was nothing like the expression of a frightened hostage. "Dogs can smell intent. They can sense when someone is dangerous. That's why he won't come near me. Because he knows what I really am." Sarah drew her weapon, but kept it pointed at the ground. "What are you?" "I'm Thomas Hartwell's insurance policy. His daughter in everything but blood, trained since childhood to be whatever a situation requires. Victim, witness, distraction, whatever keeps him 2 steps ahead of people like you." Rex's whine became more urgent, and Sarah realized he wasn't just warning her about the girl. His nose was working again, detecting something new in the chemical. Soup of scents that filled the warehouse. "The bombs aren't just for show," the girl continued, rising to her feet with fluid grace. "They're on timers. About—" She glanced at a device Sarah couldn't see clearly. 6 minutes now. Enough time for Thomas to make his final preparations, not enough time for you to escape the blast radius. Sarah keyed her radio, but got only static. "Why tell me? If you wanted me dead, you could have just let me walk into the trap. Because Thomas wants you to understand something before you die. He wants you to know that everything you think you know about his case is wrong. The courthouse bombing, the evidence that led you here, even your partnership with that broken dog. It's all been part of a larger plan." The girl reached into her jacket, and Sarah's training took over. "Hands where I can see them." But what emerged from the jacket wasn't a weapon. It was a photograph. Old, creased. showing a young man in military uniform standing next to a German shepherd that looked exactly like Rex. His name was Jason, the girl said softly. Staff Sergeant Jason Hartwell, EOD Specialist, KIA Afghanistan. 8 months ago, Thomas Hartwell's son. Sarah felt the world tilt sideways. That's impossible. Rex's handler was named Santos. Marine Corps records are surprisingly easy to falsify when you have the right connections. Jason Hartwell died trying to save his unit from an IED. His father never forgave the military for putting him in harm's way, and he never forgave the system that sent children to die for political convenience. The photograph showed Jason Hartwell kneeling beside a younger version of Rex, both of them looking directly at the camera with the easy confidence of a team that trusted each other completely. In the background, Sarah could make out the distinctive landscape of Afghanistan's mountain regions. Thomas didn't start as a terrorist, the girl continued. He started as a grieving father who wanted to understand how his son died. But the more he learned about military contracting, defense procurement, and the revolving door between government and industry, the angrier he became. Rex had moved closer to Sarah, close enough that she could feel his body heat against her leg. His attention was split between the girl and something else, the bomb components, the exits, the chemical sense that seemed to be growing stronger. 5 minutes, the girl announced. Thomas wanted you to have time to process this before the end. He wanted you to understand that Rex isn't just a police dog who lost his handler. He's Thomas Hartwell's son's partner, stolen from a military base and processed through official channels with false paperwork. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. That's why Rex wouldn't work with male handlers. He was grieving for Jason, and that's why Thomas chose you specifically for this case. A broken female detective with trust issues, partnered with his dead son's dog. He wanted to see if you could give Rex the kind of partnership Jason never got the chance to complete. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with sickening clarity. The surveillance photos that had led them to this warehouse, the anonymous tips that had kept them one step behind. Thomas Hartwell for months. The careful escalation that had brought them here alone with no backup and no way to call for help. This was never about stopping Thomas Hartwell, Sarah realized. It was about delivering Rex to him. The girl smiled, and for the first time since they'd found her, she looked genuinely pleased. Thomas loves his son's dog almost as much as he loved his son. But he needed to know Rex was in good hands, with someone who could understand what it meant to lose a partner. Rex pressed closer to Sarah, and she realized his trembling wasn't from fear. It was from the effort of controlling instincts that were screaming at him to act. His eyes never left the girl, but his body language was communicating something urgent to Sarah. Something about timing, about opportunity, about the difference between being trapped and being positioned. 4 minutes, the girl announced. Thomas will be here soon to collect Rex. You'll be dead, of course, but at least you'll die knowing you gave his son's partner the kind of loyalty Jason never got to see. Sarah made a decision that would either save their lives or kill them both. Rex, show me. What happened next would later be described in official reports as an outstanding display of interspecies communication and tactical awareness. But, in the moment, it felt like magic. Rex exploded into motion, not toward the girl but toward the desk covered with bomb components. His nose went to work with surgical precision, identifying each device and its timer mechanism. Then he began a careful circuit of the room, alerting to secondary devices that Sarah's flashlight had missed completely. 7 bombs total, all connected to a master timer that showed 3 minutes and 47 seconds, all except one, which showed 33 seconds and was hidden in the girl's jacket. Rex, protect, Sarah shouted, and her partner launched himself at the girl with the fluid grace of a predator, finally released from restraint. The girl's scream cut through the warehouse like a siren, but it wasn't pain. It was rage. The mask of helpless victim had been completely abandoned, replaced by the cold fury of someone whose carefully constructed plan had just been demolished by a dog's nose and a detective's trust in her partner. You don't understand, the girl snarled, as Rex pinned her to the concrete floor. Thomas is going to burn down everything that killed his son. The contractors, the politicians, the entire system that treats soldiers like disposable equipment. Sarah was already moving, her hands working to disconnect timer mechanisms with the kind of focused precision that came from knowing failure meant death. Rex held the girl motionless, not with excessive force but with the implacable pressure of someone who would not be moved, would not be negotiated with, would not allow harm to come to his partner. 20 seconds, Sarah counted aloud, her fingers working on the master timer. Rex, when I say run, you follow me and don't look back. But Rex didn't move from his position. His eyes met Sarah's across the warehouse floor, and in them she saw the same decision she was making, the same choice that had defined every partnership worth having. They would succeed together or fail together, but they wouldn't abandon each other. 10 seconds, Sarah whispered, and felt the timer mechanism click into place under her fingers. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt like the world holding its breath. Then Rex barked once, sharp, triumphant, alive, and Sarah knew. They had just survived something that would change everything between them forever. But as they helped each other to their feet in the darkness of the warehouse, neither of them noticed the small device blinking red in the shadows near the exit. Thomas Hartwell had been planning this for much longer than anyone imagined, and they had just walked directly into the second phase of his revenge. 3 hours after the warehouse, the Portland Police Bureau's debriefing room smelled like stale coffee and the particular brand of exhaustion that came from surviving something that should have killed you. Sarah sat across from Captain Rodriguez, her hands wrapped around a paper cup that had long since gone cold, while Rex lay at her feet with the boneless relaxation of a dog who'd completed his mission and earned his rest. Except he wasn't resting. His ears tracked every footstep in the hallway, every voice that rose above the institutional murmur of a police station at night. Sarah had learned to read his body language like a second language, and right now, Rex was speaking fluent unease. "So, let me get this straight," Captain Rodriguez said, flipping through the preliminary report for the third time. Thomas Hartwell's accomplice was a 16-year-old girl claiming to be D.A. Morrison's daughter, but she's actually some kind of, what? Professional child terrorist? The DNA results will take 48 hours to confirm, Sarah replied, but everything about her story was fabricated. Real Emma Morrison is still in Paris, has been for 6 months. We verified that with the State Department an hour ago. Rodriguez rubbed his temples like he was trying to massage away a headache that had taken up permanent residence. And this girl, whoever she is, she told you that Hartwell specifically targeted you because Rex used to be his son's military working dog. That's what she claimed. But, Captain, there's something else. Sarah leaned forward, lowering her voice. The military records don't match. I've been making calls all evening, and there's no record of a Staff Sergeant Jason Hartwell ever serving with EOD units in Afghanistan. Rex lifted his head at the change in Sarah's tone, his dark eyes moving between her and the captain, with the alert attention of someone monitoring a conversation that might affect him. So, either she was lying about that too, or Rodriguez trailed off, not wanting to voice the implications, or the records have been scrubbed, which would require access to military databases that most people don't have. Sarah scratched behind Rex's ears absently, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing. Captain, what if this whole thing is bigger than one grieving father? Gone rogue? Before Rodriguez could respond, a knock on the door interrupted them. Detective Martinez stuck his head in, his expression carrying the particular blend of confusion and urgency that usually meant bad news was about to get worse. Captain, we've got a problem. Thomas Hartwell just turned himself in. The silence that followed was broken only by Rex's low whine. Not fear, but the sound of a dog whose instincts were screaming warnings that his humans couldn't yet understand. 20 minutes later, the holding cell area of Portland PD felt different. At night, fluorescent lights buzzed with the persistence of dying insects, casting shadows that turned familiar spaces into something vaguely threatening. Sarah walked beside Captain Rodriguez, Rex at her left heel, toward the cell where Thomas Hartwell sat waiting for them, with the patience of a man who'd been expecting this moment for months. He looked smaller than his courthouse photographs suggested. Mid-50s, graying hair, wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the appearance of a college professor rather than a domestic terrorist. But when he looked up at their approach, his eyes held depths that spoke of pain transformed into something harder and more dangerous. "Detective Chen," Hartwell said, rising from the narrow bench with careful courtesy. "And Rex, of course. I've been looking forward to meeting you both properly." Rex's reaction was immediate and unsettling. Instead of the alert tension Sarah expected, he moved closer to the cell bars, his tail giving a slight wag that looked almost like recognition. Not the response of a police dog confronting a suspect, but something more complex, more personal. "You know him," Sarah said. Not a question. Hartwell smiled, and for the first time since this case began, the expression seemed genuine. "Rex and I have met before, though not under these circumstances. He's grown since Afghanistan." Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone tired of games. "Mr. Hartwell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit terrorism, possession of explosive devices, and kidnapping. Anything you say, anything you say." "The girl wasn't kidnapped," Hartwell interrupted gently. "And I'm not Thomas Hartwell." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just misfired. Sarah felt her worldview tilt sideways for the second time in 3 hours. "I'm Colonel Marcus Webb, retired Army intelligence. I've been undercover for the past 18 months, tracking the real Thomas Hartwell through a network of defense contractors and military industrialists who've been selling weapons to both sides of conflicts. For the better part of a decade." Rex pressed closer to the cell bars, and Colonel Webb reached through to scratch behind his ears with the familiarity of someone who'd done this exact gesture 1,000 times before. "Jason wasn't my son," Webb continued, his voice softening. "He was my nephew. My brother's boy, 23 years old, EOD specialist attached to my intelligence unit. He died because someone in our own command structure sold information about our patrol routes to enemy forces." Sarah's mind raced through the implications, trying to reconcile what she'd believed for months with what she was hearing now. The bombs in the warehouse, training devices, sophisticated fakes designed to test bomb-sniffing dogs and EOD personnel, completely harmless but realistic enough to fool detection equipment. Webb's expression grew grim. "The real Thomas Hartwell has been using similar devices to train terrorists in bomb-making techniques while selling them genuine explosives through back-channel military contracts." Captain Rodriguez looked like a man watching his understanding of reality crumble in real time. "So everything we thought we knew about this case was carefully constructed misdirection designed to bring the real Hartwell out of hiding." Grace stood up, moving closer to the bars. "Sarah, Rex found you because I led him to you, but not for the reasons you think." Rex's behavior was making more sense now. The way he'd responded to Webb from the beginning, the careful positioning in the warehouse, the reluctance to treat him as a threat. But something else was nagging at Sarah, some detail that didn't fit the neat narrative Webb was constructing. "The girl?" Sarah said suddenly. "If this was all an intelligence operation, why use a child?" Webb's expression darkened. "Because she's not a child. Agent Patricia Walsh, 32 years old, former military intelligence turned private contractor. She's been Thomas Hartwell's inside source in law enforcement for the past 2 years." The name hit Sarah like cold water. "Walsh, defense attorney Patricia Walsh." "The same. She's been feeding Hartwell information about investigations, court schedules, evidence, procedures, everything he needed to stay ahead of law enforcement while building his network." Rex suddenly stepped back from the cell, his ears pinning flat against his head. Not the relaxed alertness he'd shown toward Webb, but the focused tension Sarah had learned meant danger was imminent. "Rex!" Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward her weapon. "What is it, boy?" Webb followed her gaze to Rex, and his expression shifted from explanation to alarm. "He's detecting something we can't. Chemical traces, maybe pheromones associated with stress or deception." But Rex wasn't focused on Webb anymore. His attention had shifted to the hallway behind them, where the sound of approaching footsteps echoed off concrete walls. Multiple people, moving with the careful precision of individuals who knew exactly where they were going and what they intended to do when they got there. "Detective Chen," a familiar voice called from the shadows beyond the fluorescent lights. "Step away from the cell, please." Patricia Walsh emerged from the darkness, no longer playing the role of frightened teenager or defense attorney. She wore tactical gear and carried herself with the fluid confidence of someone comfortable with violence. Behind her, 3 men in similar gear flanked her movements like wolves following a pack leader. "Agent Walsh," Webb said, his voice carrying resignation and something that might have been respect. "I was wondering when you'd make your move." Sarah's hand found her weapon, but Walsh was faster. "I wouldn't, Detective. My associates have this corridor surrounded, and your backup is currently investigating a suspicious package that was called in at the courthouse, a package that will keep them busy for the next hour." Rex positioned himself between Sarah and Walsh's team, his body language screaming readiness for action. But Walsh wasn't looking at him with the wariness most people showed around police dogs. She was studying him with the clinical interest of someone evaluating equipment. "Rex belongs to us now," Walsh said. "He was never supposed to be playing police dog with broken detectives. He's a military asset, trained in techniques and capabilities that civilian law enforcement shouldn't have access to." "Over my dead body," Sarah said, and meant it. Walsh smiled. "That can be arranged." The gunshot came from behind them, echoing through the holding cell area like thunder in an enclosed space. Sarah spun toward the sound, her weapon drawn, expecting to see one of Walsh's associates. Instead, she saw Captain Rodriguez holding a smoking service pistol and Patricia Walsh crumpling to the concrete floor. "Sorry," Rodriguez said, his voice steady despite the violence he'd just committed. "But I really hate it when people threaten my officers." Walsh's associates raised their weapons, but Rex was already moving. Sarah had seen him work before, had watched him take down suspects and navigate obstacle courses, but she'd never seen him move with the lethal precision he displayed in that moment. This wasn't police dog training. This was something harder, more dangerous, learned in places where mistakes meant death. The first man went down with Rex's teeth locked on his weapon hand. The second tried to swing his rifle towards Sarah, but found himself facing 80 pounds of German Shepherd, who'd been trained to neutralize threats with extreme prejudice. The third man had the presence of mind to step back and reassess, which probably saved his life. "Stand down." Webb's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in combat situations. "Everyone just stand the hell down." The silence that followed was broken only by Rex's panting and the groans of Walsh's wounded associates. Sarah kept her weapon trained on the remaining operative, while Captain Rodriguez secured the scene with the efficient movements of someone who'd been in similar situations before. "Captain," Sarah said, not taking her eyes off their prisoners, "how long have you been working with Colonel Webb?" Rodriguez glanced at Webb through the cell bars. "About 6 months, ever since Army intelligence contacted us about a possible domestic terrorism network operating in our jurisdiction." Webb nodded. "The real Thomas Hartwell has been using Portland as a hub for weapons trafficking and terrorist training. We needed local law enforcement cooperation to build a case that would stand up in federal court." Sarah felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "So when Rex and I were assigned to this case, you were never investigating Thomas Hartwell," Webb confirmed. "You were bait in a trap designed to expose his network. And it worked." Patricia Walsh just revealed herself as a key player in an operation that spans multiple agencies and several states. Rex moved back to Sarah's side, his professional demeanor intact, but his attention still focused on potential threats. As he settled into position, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. A small device attached to his collar, blinking red in the dim fluorescent light. Something that hadn't been there 3 hours ago. "Colonel," Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled, "when was the last time you saw Rex before tonight?" Webb's expression shifted to concern. 6 months ago, when he was transferred from military custody to Portland PD. "Why?" "Why?" Sarah pointed to the device on Rex's collar. "Because either he picked up some new equipment in the warehouse, or someone's been tracking our every movement since this case began." The device blinked faster, and Rex whined softly. Not in pain, but in recognition of something familiar, something he'd encountered before in places where electronic devices usually meant incoming explosions. "Everyone out," Webb said, his voice carrying the kind of calm that came from experience with genuinely dangerous situations. "Right now, that's not a tracking device." They moved toward the exit with the controlled urgency of people who understood that panic would kill them faster than whatever was about to happen. But as they reached the corridor junction, a new voice echoed through the building's PA system. "Detective. Chen, this is Thomas Hartwell. The real one this time." Sarah felt Rex tense beside her, recognizing something in the voice that spoke to memories of Afghanistan and explosions and people who didn't come home. "I've been watching your investigation." "With considerable interest," the voice continued, "and I've decided it's time we met properly. The device on your dog's collar contains enough explosive to level this section of the building, and it's connected to a dead man's switch I'm currently holding." The PA crackled with static, then cleared. "You have 15 minutes to reach the parking garage level. Come alone, bring Rex, and we'll discuss the future of warfare in the 21st century. And detective, if you're thinking about removing the device from Rex's collar, I should mention that it's pressure sensitive. Any attempt to tamper with it will result in immediate detonation." The PA went silent, leaving them standing in a corridor that suddenly felt like a tomb. Section 5. Collapse and Revelation, Emotional Fall. 14 minutes remaining. The elevator descended through Portland PD with the mechanical precision of a countdown timer, each floor bringing them closer to whatever Thomas Hartwell had planned. Sarah stood with her back against the wall, Rex pressed against her legs, both of them sharing the kind of silence that came from knowing they might be about to die together. The device on Rex's collar blinked in steady rhythm, a red metronome counting down to either salvation or destruction. Sarah had considered every possible way to remove it during their descent, but each scenario ended with the same result, an explosion that would kill them both before they could help anyone else. "We don't have to do this," Sarah said quietly, speaking to Rex as much as to herself. "We could evacuate the building, call in federal bomb disposal, wait for experts who know how to handle this kind of situation." Rex looked up at her with dark eyes that seemed older than his years, and in them she saw the same decision she was making. They had become partners, not just in training exercises and routine calls, but in the deeper sense that mattered when everything else fell away. They trusted each other with their lives, and that trust meant facing danger together rather than abandoning each other to safety. The elevator doors opened onto the parking garage, revealing a space that looked like something from an action movie. Concrete pillars cast geometric shadows under harsh fluorescent lighting, and somewhere in the distance, water dripped with the persistence of a leaky faucet. The air smelled like motor oil, exhaust fumes, and something else, the metallic scent that Rex had taught her to associate with explosives. "Impressive response time," a voice called from the shadows near the far wall. "I was expecting you to spend more time debating whether to trust my word about the dead man's switch." Thomas Hartwell stepped into the light, and Sarah immediately understood why Colonel Webb's impersonation had been so convincing. They could have been brothers, similar height, similar build, similar age. But where Webb carried himself with military bearing, Hartwell moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that every gesture might be his last. "Mr. Hartwell," Sarah said, keeping her voice level, "you wanted to talk. I'm here. Please call me Thomas. After everything we've been through together, formality seems unnecessary." He gestured to a space near the center of the garage where two folding chairs sat facing each other like a parody of a therapy session. "Shall we sit? This may take a while." Rex moved with Sarah toward the chairs, his gait careful and controlled. The device on his collar continued its steady blinking, but his attention was focused on Hartwell, with the kind of intensity usually reserved for immediate threats. "He remembers me," Hartwell observed as they sat down. "Dogs have excellent memory for voices, scents, emotional associations. Rex knows exactly who I am and what I represent." Sarah settled into her chair, Rex positioning himself between her and Hartwell with professional precision. "And what do you represent, Thomas?" "The future of warfare, detective. The evolution of conflict from government-sponsored violence to market-driven innovation." Hartwell's smile was the expression of someone who'd found genuine pleasure in explaining something he was passionate about. "Do you know what the military-industrial complex's greatest weakness is?" "Enlighten me." "Bureaucracy, government oversight, congressional hearings and budget limitations, and rules of engagement that make it nearly impossible to develop weapons systems with the kind of efficiency the market demands. Hartwell gestured toward Rex. Take your partner, for example. Military working dogs represent millions of dollars in training and development, but they're limited by political considerations and ethical guidelines that prevent their full utilization. Sarah felt ice water in her veins. What kind of full utilization? Rex isn't just trained to detect explosives, Detective. He's been modified to deliver them. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She looked down at Rex, who was watching Hartwell with the kind of focus that suggested he understood exactly what was being discussed. That's impossible, Sarah said, but even as she spoke, pieces of a horrifying puzzle were falling into place. Rex's unusual behavior in certain situations, his reluctance to work with male handlers, the way he'd positioned himself in the warehouse, always maintaining distance from potential targets. Military working dogs have been weaponized for decades, Hartwell continued, usually with conventional explosives, suicide attacks against enemy positions, remote detonation devices for assassination missions. But Rex represents something more sophisticated. Hartwell reached into his jacket, moving slowly to avoid triggering any defensive response from Rex. What he pulled out wasn't a weapon, but a tablet computer displaying what looked like medical imaging. Surgical implants, Detective. Undetectable. By conventional screening methods. Controllable via encrypted radio signals. Powerful enough to eliminate targets within a 50-meter radius. Hartwell turned the tablet towards Sarah, showing cross-sectional images of what appeared to be Rex's internal anatomy. He's been carrying enough plastic explosive to level a building for the past 8 months. Sarah's world collapsed into a single point of focus. The dog sitting beside her, the partner she'd trusted with her life, the animal she'd come to love like family. Rex looked up at her with the same steady confidence he'd always shown, but now she understood what she was really looking at. A living weapon, a bomb with fur and loyalty and dark brown eyes that had learned to trust her completely. The collar. Device is just the trigger mechanism, Hartwell explained. Remove it, and the surgical implants detonate immediately. Try to jam the radio signal, same result. The only way to prevent detonation is to keep Rex within range of my transmitter and follow my instructions exactly. Sarah's hands were shaking now, and she pressed them against her knees to hide the tremor. What do you want? I want to demonstrate the future of asymmetric warfare, Hartwell said. Politicians and military leaders who make decisions about war and peace while sitting safely in offices thousands of miles from the consequences of their choices. Rex represents the ability to bring those consequences directly to their doorsteps. You're talking about assassination. I'm talking about accountability, about making sure the people who profit from conflict understand that they're not immune to its effects. Hartwell's voice carried the passion of someone who'd convinced himself he was fighting for justice. Every defense contractor, every senator who votes for military budgets, every general who sends soldiers to die for corporate profits, they all need to understand that their decisions have personal consequences. Rex whined softly, and Sarah realized he was responding to her emotional state. Dogs were sensitive to stress hormones, and her body was currently flooding itself with enough adrenaline to power a small city. How many others, Sarah asked, how many other dogs have you modified? Rex was the prototype. If this demonstration proves successful, we'll begin full-scale production within 6 months. Hartwell leaned forward, his expression intense. Imagine hundreds of weaponized K9 units placed with police departments and security agencies across the country. Sleeper agents with 4 legs and wagging tails, completely beyond suspicion until the moment of activation. Sarah felt nausea rising in her throat. The people who work with these dogs, their handlers, their trainers, their families, acceptable casualties in a larger conflict. Every war requires sacrifice, Detective. The question is whether those sacrifices will be random civilians killed by conventional terrorism, or carefully selected targets whose deaths will actually accomplish strategic objectives. Rex stood up suddenly, his attention focused on something beyond Sarah's perception. His ears were forward, his body language alert but not aggressive. Then Sarah heard it too, the distant sound of vehicles approaching the parking garage. Your backup, Hartwell observed. Right on schedule. Sarah's radio crackled to life. K97, this is command. Federal agents are taking control of this situation. Stand down and await further instructions. But before Sarah could respond, Hartwell held up a device that looked like a modified cell phone. Detective, I need you to understand something very important. This transmitter isn't just connected to Rex's implants. It's networked to 17 other devices, currently attached to K9 units across 6 states. The implications hit Sarah like a falling building. You've done this to other dogs. Police departments, sheriff's offices, federal agencies, all agree. Them eager to acquire highly trained working dogs at reduced cost. They never asked too many questions about the dog's previous medical history. Hartwell's smile was the expression of someone who'd just revealed a winning hand in a game where the stakes were measured in human lives. 18 bombs, Detective. 18 loyal, trusting animals who have no idea they're carrying enough explosive power to eliminate city blocks. And all of them will detonate simultaneously if anything happens to this transmitter. Rex moved closer to Sarah, pressing against her legs with the kind of contact that usually meant he was seeking reassurance. But as she looked down at him, Sarah realized he wasn't looking for comfort. He was trying to tell her something. His eyes were focused on Hartwell's transmitter with laser intensity, and his body language was screaming information that took Sarah precious seconds to interpret. Then she understood. Rex wasn't just alerting to the presence of explosives. He was alerting to a specific type of explosive, one with a particular chemical signature that his training had taught him to identify. Training he'd received not from military EOD specialists, but from someone who'd needed him to recognize the difference between real bombs and training devices. "Thomas," Sarah said carefully, "show me the transmitter again." Hartwell held up the device, proud of his technological sophistication. But as Rex's nose worked, processing scent signatures invisible to human perception, Sarah saw the truth written in his posture. The transmitter was a fake. Sophisticated, convincing, but ultimately just another training prop designed to test whether law enforcement would believe an impossible threat. Thomas Hartwell was exactly what he appeared to be, a.e., grieving father who'd lost his son to war and his sanity to rage. But he wasn't a master terrorist with access to surgical modification technology and networks of weaponized animals. He was a man with enough technical knowledge to build convincing replicas and enough pain to sell them as genuine threats. "Rex," Sarah whispered, "show me." Her partner moved toward Hartwell with purpose, his nose leading him directly to the transmitter. When he sat and raised his paw, the alert signal for training devices rather than genuine explosives, Sarah felt reality reassemble itself around a completely different truth. "The collar device is real," she said, understanding flooding through, her like dawn breaking. "But everything else is theater." Hartwell's expression shifted from confidence to resignation. "You figured it out. Rex figured it out. He's been trying to tell me since we got here that the transmitter doesn't match the collar device. Different chemical signatures, different construction methods." Sarah stood up, her hand moving to her weapon. "There are no surgical implants. No network of weaponized dogs. Just one bomb, one grieving father, and one hell of a convincing performance." "The threat is still real," Hartwell said, but his voice had lost its earlier conviction. "The device on Rex's collar contains enough explosive to kill both of you." "Maybe. But 18 other dogs aren't going to die if I shoot you right now." Sarah drew her weapon, but before she could aim, Rex moved between them again. Not to protect Hartwell, but to give Sarah a clear message. The situation wasn't what it appeared to be. The device on his collar had stopped blinking. Section 6. The Shift. Rage, Love, Resolve. The parking garage fell silent, except for the sound of Sarah's heartbeat thundering in her ears. Rex sat perfectly still, his dark eyes moving between Sarah and Hartwell, with the calm assessment of a professional who'd just identified the real nature of their situation. The device on his collar, the red light that had been blinking with mechanical precision for the past hour, was now dark, lifeless, nothing more than an elaborate prop in a performance that had just reached its final act. How long have you known? Sarah asked, her weapon still trained on Hartwell, but her voice carrying something that might have been respect. Hartwell smiled, and for the first time since this began, the expression seemed to come from the man rather than the role he'd been playing. Known what, detective? That Rex would figure it out, that his training would let him distinguish between real threats and theatrical ones. Sarah took a step closer, Rex moving with her in perfect synchronization. You've been counting on it. Jason trained him well, Hartwell said softly, better than any of us realized at the time. The name hung in the air between them like an unfinished sentence. Sarah felt pieces of the truth shifting into new configurations, building a picture that was both simpler and more complex than anything she'd imagined. Jason was real, she said. Your son, EOD specialist, killed in Afghanistan. But everything else, the military conspiracy, the weapons trafficking, the network of modified animals, theater, misdirection, a grieving father's elaborate attempt to understand whether the system that killed his son was capable of recognizing genuine threats. Hartwell's voice carried the weight of someone who'd been carrying impossible pain for longer than human hearts were designed to bear. Rex stood and walked toward Hartwell, his movement careful but not defensive. When he reached the older man, he sat down and placed one paw on Hartwell's knee, not an alert signal, but the kind of gesture that spoke to connections deeper than training or duty. He remembers Jason, Hartwell said, his hand moving to scratch behind Rex's ears with practiced familiarity. They were together for 2 years before the IED, 2 years of learning to trust each other completely, to communicate without words, to depend on each other for survival. Sarah lowered her weapon but didn't holster it. What really happened in Afghanistan? Jason's unit was assigned to clear a route that intelligence reports said was safe. But someone in the chain of command had made a mistake, or been bought off, we never found out which. The patrol walked into a trap that killed 8 Marines and wounded 12 others. Hartwell's voice became clinical, the tone of someone who'd told this story so many times. It had become a recitation rather than a memory. Rex detected the explosives 30 seconds before they detonated. He alerted. Jason called for the patrol to halt, but they were already in the kill zone. Jason threw himself on top of Rex when the bombs went off. Saved the dog's life, but the shrapnel. Hartwell's voice trailed off, and Sarah could see him fighting against emotions that threatened to overwhelm the careful control he'd maintained for months. Rex was wounded but alive. Jason died en route to the field hospital, but not before making his commanding officer promise that Rex would be taken care of. Hartwell looked up at Sarah with eyes that held depths of pain she was only beginning to understand. I've spent the past year trying to honor that promise. Sarah felt her worldview shifting again, reorganizing around the simple truth that sometimes love looked like elaborate deception, and sometimes justice required breaking laws that were supposed to protect people. The warehouse setup, the fake bombs, Colonel Webb's undercover operation, you orchestrated all of it to test whether Rex would be safe with civilian law enforcement. I needed to know if you could earn his trust, if you could read his signals, understand his needs, give him the kind of partnership Jason never got the chance to complete. Hartwell's hand continued stroking Rex's head with the unconscious familiarity of someone who'd done this gesture thousands of times. Most importantly, I needed to know if you'd be willing to risk your life to protect him. And Patricia Walsh, the fake defense attorney, the teenage accomplice routine, Army intelligence. Colonel Webb's operation is real. There are weapons, trafficking networks operating through military contractors. Walsh volunteered to help create a scenario that would test your partnership with Rex under extreme stress. Sarah holstered her weapon and knelt down beside Rex, her hand joining Hartwell's in the ancient ritual of human connection, with animals who'd earned their place in our lives through loyalty and courage. The device on his collar? Training aid. Sophisticated enough to fool electronic detection, but completely harmless. Rex knew from the beginning. He just needed time to make sure you trusted him enough to listen when he tried to tell you. Rex looked up at Sarah with an expression that managed to convey both apology and pride. He'd known she was walking into an elaborate test, but he'd also known she needed to pass that test on her own terms, with her own instincts and her own courage. So what happens now? Sarah asked. Before Hartwell could answer, the sound of approaching. Vehicles filled the parking garage. Multiple engines, coordinated movement, the careful orchestration of law enforcement professionals who'd been waiting for their cue to enter the scene. "Now," Hartwell said, standing up with Rex beside him, "you get to decide whether you want to arrest me for the crimes I actually committed or help me finish what Jason and Rex started." Captain Rodriguez appeared from behind a concrete pillar, followed by Colonel Webb and a team of federal agents who moved with the precise coordination of people who'd been planning this moment for months. "Detective Chen," Rodriguez called. "Status report." Sarah looked around the parking garage, at the federal agents who'd been watching from concealment, at Colonel Webb, who'd somehow managed to escape from his holding cell, at Thomas Hartwell, who was watching her with the calm attention of someone whose fate now rested in her hands. "Rex and I are fine, Captain. The explosive device was a training aid, the threat was contained, and—" She paused, looking down at her partner who was watching her with dark eyes that seemed to hold infinite patience. "And I think we need to have a conversation about what it really means to honor the service of military working dogs who've given everything for their country." Colonel Webb stepped forward, his expression serious but not hostile. "Thomas, you've led us on quite a chase. Care to explain what this was really about?" "It was about making sure Rex found someone worth trusting," Hartwell replied. "Someone who'd listen to his instincts, respect his training, and understand that some partnerships transcend simple duty." He looked at Sarah with something that might have been approval. "Detective Chen has demonstrated that she's willing to risk her life based on nothing more than Rex's assessment of a situation. That's the kind of trust military working dogs deserve from their human partners." Rex moved away from Hartwell and positioned himself at Sarah's left side, the classic Kotundi Henla formation, but there was something different in his posture now. Not just professional readiness, but the relaxed confidence of an animal who'd found his place in the world. "There's something else," Hartwell said, reaching into his jacket with movements, careful enough to avoid triggering any defensive responses from the federal agents. "Something Jason wanted Rex to have if anything happened to him." What he pulled out was a collar, worn leather with metal tags that caught the fluorescent light like stars. One tag bore Rex's name and service number. The other carried a simple inscription: "For courage above and beyond, Jason and Rex, Afghanistan 2023. Jason made this himself, during their downtime between missions. He wanted Rex to have something that belonged to both of them, something that would remind him he was valued for more than just his training." Sarah took the collar with hands that trembled slightly, feeling the weight of history and sacrifice, in worn leather and tarnished metal. When she looked at Rex, his tail was wagging, not the controlled acknowledgement of a working dog, but the pure joy of an animal who'd been given something precious. "The question," Colonel Webb said, "is what happens next? Thomas, you've technically committed several federal crimes in the course of this elaborate demonstration. And Detective Chen has proven that civilian law enforcement can provide military working dogs with the kind of partnership they deserve," Hartwell replied. "I'd say we've both accomplished our objectives." Sarah looked around the parking garage at the assembled law enforcement professionals, then down at Rex, who was watching her with the kind of attention that suggested he understood the weight of whatever decision she was about to make. "Colonel Webb, what exactly is the status of that weapons trafficking investigation?" "Ongoing. We've identified several key players, but we need someone with Thomas's technical knowledge and inside connections to help us build prosecutable cases." Sarah felt the pieces of a solution forming in her mind. "And the military working dog program? How many animals like Rex are being retired without proper placement in civilian law enforcement?" "Too many," Webb admitted. "Budget constraints, limited training resources, bureaucratic complications. Good dogs are being warehoused when they could be saving lives in civilian applications." "Then maybe," Sarah said, "we've just identified a way for Thomas to serve his community service sentence. Technical consultation on military working dog integration with civilian law enforcement, supervised by federal authorities, with all proceeds going to veteran and working dog support programs." Thomas Hartwell smiled, and this time the expression carried genuine warmth. "Detective, I think Jason would approve of that solution." Rex barked once, sharp, clear, decisive, and everyone in the parking garage understood they'd just received approval from the most important authority involved in this entire situation. As federal agents began the paperwork that would transform Thomas Hartwell from terrorist suspect to government consultant, Sarah knelt beside Rex and carefully replaced his utilitarian police collar with the worn leather artifact Jason had made in Afghanistan. "How does that feel, partner?" she asked. Rex's response was to press his head against her shoulder, not seeking comfort, but offering it. The gesture of an animal who'd found his way home at last. Section 7. Final Trial. Climax 6 months later. Federal Courthouse, Portland. The courtroom was different this time. Bigger, with higher ceilings and windows that let in natural light that seemed to illuminate truth rather than shadow it. Sarah stood at the witness stand with Rex at her side, both of them wearing dress uniforms that carried more meaning than fabric and metal could usually hold. Rex's collar, Jason's collar, caught the light from the windows, the worn leather, and tarnished tags telling a story that spanned continents and wars, and the kind of love that transcended species boundaries. Detective Chen, Federal Prosecutor Amanda Rivera, said, "Please tell the court about your experiences working with working dogs who've been transitioned to civilian law enforcement." Sarah looked out at the gallery, where Thomas,